This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Recently, Games Workshop announced that a rather large amount of models are being retired from the Age of Sigmar range, as well as its skirmish equivalent, which uses the same models, Warcry. And a lot of people are quite upset about this, I think quite justifiably. But you've seen those videos already. This isn't an outrage video. I do, of course, want to discuss the models being retired as well as why I think that's happening, but before we do, I'd like to talk about the reason beneath it all, the reason for the outrage in the first place. The Games Workshop promise and what happens when it's broken. Part 1. What is the Games Workshop promise? If you're involved in this hobby at all, whether you just paint the models, whether you play the games, whether you consume the lore, you already know what the Games Workshop promise really is. You might not be able to define it in words, but I think you instinctively know what I'm talking about. It's the reason we still buy and play Warhammer instead of cheaper, possibly more interesting indie games. It's the reason a certain subset of fans still get upset when you mention even the concept, even the idea of female space marines. It's the reason some fantasy fans are still mad about the existence of Age of Sigmar, and it's the reason we all care a little bit too much about this one company who clearly don't give a hoot about their end consumer. What is the Games Workshop promise? Well, if I had to sum it up in just a few words, it would probably be something like this. Invest in us and you, well, at least your hobby, will live forever. Let me explain. Whether it's the models you've invested all of that money into or all the hours of time painting and customizing them, learning their rules or even just their lore, one thing Games Workshop has over all of the other miniatures companies is just that they've existed for so very long. So when you buy into their ecosystem in the form of time, money, or effort, it can feel like a safer investment versus buying or painting or learning the rules or even the lore of a game that hasn't existed for that long. You know that when you buy an army, even if it's very expensive, even if it takes you hours and hours to paint and learn the rules, that it's a safe investment of time, that you'll be able to use this army, that you'll be able to use these models for years, maybe even decades to come. And the same is true for the lore. You spent the time learning all of that backstory, that isn't likely to change anytime soon. Sure, the rules themselves might change, a few models might be removed or added, but aside from that, your time, your effort, your money, all feels like a safe investment. That is, until it isn't. Because there's been a few times when Games Workshop has broken the promise, and it's these times when you see the outrage crop up. The first major breaking of the promise was when Warhammer Fantasy was retired and replaced with Age of Sigmar. Now, I wasn't really a part of the hobby at this time, but you can still feel the impact of this broken promise today. As you can tell from my comments section of any video where I even mention Age of Sigmar, including probably this one, a subset of the community are still so angry about Age of Sigmar even existing, even with fantasy now coming back in the form of the old world. And I can't really say that they're wrong, I understand that perspective. The second major breaking of the promise was probably the Primaris Space Marines, which I remember people were pretty angry about at the time. The idea that you would have to replace all of your old Space Marines that you lovingly crafted with brand new ones that were in a completely different scale, making all of their old ones kind of obsolete, was pretty controversial at the time. And there have been a ton of other examples since then. Basically, whenever a big change happens that affects the status quo of a Warhammer property, at least a change that affects our investment as fans, that's when people get angry, that's when they feel that the promise has been broken. Which brings us to today. Part 2, Retired Models. So about a week ago at this point, probably 2 weeks by the time this video comes out, it was announced that a number of models are being retired from the Age of Sigmar range, with the launch of 4th edition coming out this summer. A few of these are what you would expect for older models to slowly be phased out. That's nothing new. But we're also seeing entire factions or sub-factions being retired, as well as a huge amount of the Warcry range. And a lot of this stuff isn't even that old. We're talking models that were new on the shelf 6 years ago or less. So you can see why people are upset and why this is the biggest blow to the Games Workshop promise in quite a while now. Suddenly, nothing Games Workshop produces seems like a safe investment anymore. Because if Horns of Hashut, a Warcry warband produced less than 2 years ago, is no longer going to be usable, what does that mean for all of the Kill Team warbands that I'm excited about painting? For some of us, this feels pretty scary. For others, it might make us angry. I think both of those reactions are totally justified, but for me, it just makes me feel disappointed, as I think the main issue here is just poor communication. In this article, we are shown a whole bunch of models being retired with no real explanation as to why. Sure, it's pretty clear to me, and maybe a lot of other people, that there's a reason behind this, a logic behind each of these different models being retired, but none of that is explained here, which just leads to panic and outrage. And I really think that if the writers of this article had been allowed to be a little bit more transparent as to the reasons that each of these models were going away and what that means for the future of these games, I don't think we would be in this situation at all. So let's go through these models category by category, and I'll tell you what I think are the actual reasons as to why these are going away, which ones are just being replaced with newer models, and you'll still be able to use your older ones as proxies. And then slowly we'll get into the more obscure stuff. But speaking of more obscure stuff, have you seen my website lately? If you haven't, you might be interested to know that I've been putting more work into it than ever before. Adding new items to the store to help pay off my crippling debts, updating my galleries of painted models to help commemorate some of these models that will be going away soon. And it's all been quite fun and easy to do thanks to this video's sponsor, Squarespace. As you might know, Squarespace is the all-in-one website and hosting platform that I've been using personally for over a decade now for all of my website needs. It's always been pretty fun and easy to make a website with Squarespace. You just pick from one of their professionally designed templates, add in any extra pages or features you might want, and then customize things to your heart's content using their extremely cool drag and drop grid system, which I have just learned is called their Fluid Engine. But it's actually even easier to make a Squarespace now than ever thanks to their new feature, Squarespace Blueprints, which instead of using a stock template, asks you what types of things you want or need on your website, and then allows you to customize your very own template from scratch. It was pretty fun and easy to use, and I would definitely recommend it to beginners making their very first website, or advanced users who want some fun new ideas for their existing website. I'm definitely stealing some ideas it recommended. So if you need a website, why not check out squarespace.com today for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/Dana Howl for 10% off your very first purchase of a website or domain. And now let's go through each category of models being retired, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on each one, what I think the real reason is for each one of these being retired, as well as slowly descending into tinfoil hat territory towards the end with some theories that I have been hearing on the internet. Category 1, old resin models. These are all pretty expected to retire. They're all ancient models. I think they're all made of resin. This seems pretty reasonable. Enough said about this category. Category 2, moving into more controversial territory, let's talk Bone Splitters and Beastmen. I know this one really hurts for a lot of people, and you have my sympathies. I'm really sorry if you're a Beastmen player. If you're a Bone Splitters player, I'm really sorry if you're a Beastmen player. because it's essentially an entire army being retired, a real fan favorite army from what I understand, with a cult following, as well as a subset of an army with the, what are they called? Bone splitters? Yeah, I guess the bone splitters are being retired too. And the reason for the retiring of these models is a lot less clear than it is with the first category. Honestly, this category seems like it comes completely out of nowhere, and if this is your army, it would make me pretty angry, probably. Probably make me stop playing Age of Sigmar. Not that I play Age of Sigmar, but this one seems completely out of nowhere, at least unless you understand the internal politics of Games Workshop, and I don't really understand that, so I'm going to recommend you go and check out a video, link in the description, from Rob the Honest Wargamer, who I think has a better insight into why these two model lines are going away. With that said, if Rob is correct, or even close to correct, I don't think we're going to see this happen again. I wouldn't predict an entire army to just be erased from Age of Sigmar again, as I don't think we're ever going to see another situation where the old world gets introduced and we have to split things up for weird internal political reasons. So that's at least a little bit comforting, but my condolences go to you Beastmen players out there. It's pretty rough. Category 3, Stormcast and Skaven. So there are an absolutely massive amount of Stormcast and Skaven models being retired. A lot of these Skaven models are absolutely ancient, and it's honestly surprising they haven't been cut already. So that makes sense. I don't think anyone's super mad about that. But almost half of these Stormcast models are like 6 years old or less. These are the models that were just coming out as I was getting curious about the game back in 2019, so I can see why people are upset, but I think the real issue here is the wording and the lack of explanation, as I don't think most of these models are actually being retired so much as they are being replaced. With most of these Stormcast models, we've already seen that they're getting replaced with new sculpts, and I would imagine in most cases, you'll just be able to use your old ones as proxies, probably even use some of your old Skaven as proxies if you wanted. So I think a lot of this is being blown out of proportion. A lot of these models I think are just going to be getting replaced with new ones. But of course, we don't know that because of the lack of communication here. Of course, I'm not a Stormcast player myself because I was overwhelmed by the amount of different models and I didn't know how to build an army. So personally, I kind of like the idea that the number of units is getting pruned down. Ideally, I would love to see all of the models just grouped together as like these 3 sculpts all count as this one stat sheet. That would be my ideal, but who knows what's going to happen here. Hopefully Games Workshop will give us an update, but my hopes are high that a lot of this stuff is just getting replaced, not retired, and we'll still be able to use a lot of our old models. Category 4. Warcry warbands. This final category, in my opinion, is the most disappointing, the most frustrating, but also the most intriguing and the most ripe for theory crafting. And that is the 10 Warcry warbands being retired, as well as Kagra's Ravagers, the Warcry Underworld's warband for some reason. And once again, all of these models are 5 years old or less, with some of them being much, much more recent than that, like the Horns of Hashut, which are just barely 2 years old. So what's really going on here? We are told that these models are being retired, that they're going to be getting Legends rules in Age of Sigmar, which will be valid for a year. And that seems fair enough, I guess. They want to push their new infantry models for the Chaos Undivided faction. They don't want us to be using all of the cooler looking Warcry warbands. I do like the idea that you're not going to have to choose between like 12 different types of infantry for that army. That doesn't really make sense from a game design perspective. So that's fine, I guess. Hopefully we can still proxy these as the Dark Oath infantry, whatever they're called. But what about the game these models were designed for? What about Warcry? Sure, the models themselves are being retired, but will they get rules in Warcry 3.0? Which I would assume not, as if these models are being retired, it would be unfair for those who do own them to be able to play them and no one else would be able to. Now, we aren't due for a new edition of Warcry until next summer at the soonest, but it really makes you wonder if we are getting a new edition of Warcry, why would they retire 10 of its most iconic warbands with sculpts that are really good in my opinion and just a few years old? And heck, what does this mean for Kill Team and all of its wonderful bespoke warbands that we've been getting over the past few years? Are those only going to be good for a few years as well? And this is where we get into speculation territory. I'm going to recommend you go and watch this video by Glass Half Dead. Love his channel. You should go and check out this video I'm recommending to you in the comments, where he talks about this idea that apparently Warcry and Warhammer Underworlds, both of the two smaller Age of Sigmar games, are not doing so well from a profit perspective. And so he talks about this theory. I forget if it was a leak or it's just his own theory. I think it's based on a leak. The Warhammer Underworlds is going to be retired entirely, and Warcry itself will be getting a huge reboot as a system as of 3.0. Based on this leak, the new Warcry system is going to apparently resemble Mordheim, which is pretty cool if true, with the main focus of the relaunch being Cities of Sigmar versus Skaven. So once again, if you want more info on this, go and watch that video by Glass Half Dead. Love his channel. Highly recommend go watch all his videos if you like Kill Team and skirmish games. But whether this leak is real or not, if you're a fan of Mordheim, and if you've been paying any attention to the unfolding narrative of Age of Sigmar, the idea of a Warcry 3.0, which is at least a stylistic homage to Mordheim, is going to make a lot of sense to you. And honestly, it's been something I've been kind of expecting ever since we learned Skaven were getting a model line refresh and Cities of Sigmar have come back into the limelight. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, let me explain a little bit further. The original Mordheim starter set was 2 warbands, Empire and Skaven, battling it out in a ruined cityscape in the old world. This was back in Warhammer Fantasy days. And what are 2 factions that could both use a lot of fleshing out right now and are both in kind of a spotlight position in Age of Sigmar? That's right, it is the modern equivalent to the Empire, the Cities of Sigmar, as well as the Skaven. So I could totally picture a revamp of Warcry, which is an homage to Mordheim, which features these 2 factions. Let me paint a little word picture for you to really set the scene. What have AOS fans been asking for since literally the inception of the game? Houses. Just I know it seems really simple, but just basic city terrain, basic dwelling units for terrain, which is something we surprisingly still haven't really gotten in the way people want. 3rd edition, we kind of got this in the form of these half-built buildings, which I quite liked. I don't know how the community received them. And it made sense at the time, as 3rd edition, the narrative was all about building new cities, so it made sense to have these half-built buildings. So what better way to flesh out AOS 4th edition than to give us all new city terrain, to show us these fully built cities, and you could release all kinds of cool city terrain through the Warcry boxes. Meanwhile, in Cities of Sigmar, we just got a refresh of the Cities of Sigmar line with some really cool models, but they're also all quite generic. They only really feel like they represent one city, whereas in the lore, each city is supposed to look and feel quite different. So what better way to flesh out each individual city than giving us all the different mortal warbands for each city in Warcry? The Pirates of Misthaven could look quite different from the forest-dwelling folk of Hammerhall Gyra, for example. This would be a great way to explore that, and even if all of these infantry models had the same rules in Age of Sigmar, they could all have their own unique rules in Warcry. I would love that, personally. And you could do the same thing with the various clans of the Skaven, as well as the occasional other units from other armies, which you could sprinkle in to the new edition of Warcry, which will all be city themed. And what better way to get all of the possible money out of us than to do a spiritual homage to Mordheim? It would be so popular. So that would be what I would want from Warcry 3.0. If you're gonna get rid of all the cool Chaos Warbands, just give us more time, because that would be a pretty good apology. I would accept that apology. Honestly, if that were the case, I don't think I would really even mind if like a lot of these warbands are getting cycled out of play every 6 years. That feels fair to me. I mean, I don't want entire armies to be removed like Beasts of Chaos has been, but if it's just a warband, maybe it's okay if there's a sort of Magic the Gathering style cycling in and out of these warbands. It would be nice to have something else to use them for once they do get cycled out, similar to how Magic the Gathering has Commander, where you can use any of the models. So maybe they could come up with something like that if they do want to cycle these warbands out so quickly. But anyway, that is just my thoughts. I could probably ramble on about this for even longer, but I think we should cut it off there. That is my thoughts on all of these models being retired, and some fun theories as well. So that is all of my thoughts. That is what I think. Let me know what you think down in the comments. I'm actually very curious to see what the community feels about this. Thank you so much to all of our generous patrons for constantly supporting the channel. I really appreciate you, and I will see all of you in the next video.